So give it 3 seconds, and now it is live, and we are going to hit record. Three, two. Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. I try to learn something from every single one of my guests, and I think I'm going to learn quite a bit on this call. So stay tuned for this. I'm going to read off a bio that's going to blow your mind, I think, about William H. Janeway. Janeway, I believe is how you say it. Bill is what he goes by. This book has been named one of the 6 best economic books of the year by the Financial Times. Bill Janeway has lived a double life of a theorist practitioner, according to the legendary economist Hyman Minsky, who first applied that term to him 25 years ago. In his role as practitioner, Bill Janeway, I keep saying Janeway, so I apologize for that. Janeway has been an active venture capital investor for more than 40 years. During that time, he built and led the Warburg Pincus technology investment team that provided financial backing to a series of companies making critical contributions to the internet economy, including BEA Systems, Veritas Software, and more recently, Nuance Communications, the speech recognition company. He remains actively engaged as a senior advisor and managing director of Warburg Pincus. And the book that
Warburg, Mike. Warburg.
Warburg. I'm
It's
sorry.
a feature. It's a feature, not a bug.
Warburg. I apologize. The book, guys, is I'm telling you, he has some names that are associated with it that will blow your mind. Have you ever heard of a guy named George Soros? Well, yeah, he signed off on this book, Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy. And it's markets, speculation, and the state. Bill, I appreciate your time, and thank you for giving me a little bit of leeway with some of that pronunciation.
Very good. Very good.
Well, thanks
So,
for being
Mike,
here.
the book, which first was published way back in 2012 in partial response to the global financial crisis, second edition 2018, expanded and extended to take account of the Trump presidency and the Brexit vote in Britain. It's a book of two halves, as they say when they talk about football matches in Europe. The first half is how I learned how the innovation economy works through the practice of venture capital, through my engagement as a venture capitalist. I learned about the dependence of venture capital investment on previous massive expenditures by government, specifically the United States Department of Defense, which built a platform for the IT digital revolution, and the National Institutes of Health, which built a platform for biotech. And then how, from time to time, technological innovation promises the potential of actually creating a new economy, which in turn stimulates waves of speculation. We can track it all the way back to the early days of the railroads, through electrification in the roaring 20s, and of course, the great internet.com tech bubble boom of the 1990s. And now we have something like that going on around generative AI, if you haven't been asleep for the last 2 years. But then the second half of the book is what you need to know, what you need to understand about how the role of the state, the role of the government, and financial speculation interact to transform the market economy. And indeed, although it always takes longer and usually costs more than the speculators hope, eventually produce a new economy such as the one we're learning to live in today. And along the way, it may also cause major, massive disruptions with political consequences as jobs are destroyed and new jobs are created, but not necessarily exactly in step.
Mm-hmm. Well, you said the role of the state whenever it comes to capitalism. I always think that leads to crony capitalism. I think there's favoritism and there's money being pushed into certain companies based off of, I guess, backroom deals. And to
Well,
me, the free
I think
market is
that's a
cut out.
gross
What?
simplification. DARPA is not run as an exercise in crony capitalism. Because of DARPA's investments at the frontier of science and technology. You have the internet, you have GPS, you have a whole array of technologies. Now, you might say that Google's exploitation of the grant it received from the National Science Foundation to take a PhD student's dream and turn it into the PageRank algorithm, on the basis of which one of the greatest companies in the history of capital was created. Perhaps, I don't know, do you really think that Larry Page and Sergey Brin had an inside track at the NSF and provided some booze and broads to the guys who made the grant proposal? I think the simplicities of a kind of libertarian government only exists in order to screw up markets that otherwise would give you the efficient, fair answer is an utter and total misreading of the history of capitalism over the last 250 years. Of course, there's always room for corruption. Of course, in some places, in some countries, corruption reaches a scale that it paralyzes the innovation economy. It almost happened in the US in the years after the Civil War, before a German immigrant named Carl Schurz cleaned things up and created the civil service based on not patronage of politicians, but competitive examinations. It did exist in Britain 200 years ago, and then that got cleaned up a little about a generation before the US. Clearly, Xi in China is really worried about corruption compromising China's rise to world leadership. There's always a potential for it, but that corruption tax on the innovation economy can be addressed, can be limited, can be constrained. And we've seen the results again and again in how government initiatives translate into enormous commercial opportunities and financial wealth in the private sector.
Now, you've been a venture capitalist for, you said, many years. Were you a part of any of these monsters whenever they were babies? Did you see them come to life? Were you instrumental in maybe having the deals come to fruition or anything?
Well, I guess the critical two initiatives that I played a role in identifying and then aggressively funding. The first emerged in the 1980s. At that point, thanks indeed to a number of projects of the United States Department of Defense, which provided funding at major universities like MIT, technology emerged that enabled computers to be networked together. This is before the internet. This is when computers were closed, vertically integrated, proprietary, locked machines from the hardware processor through the operating system software and onto the applications. It was a world of IBM, digital equipment, Hewlett-Packard. None of these machines talked to each other. Each of them had their own languages that you had to write in order to do anything useful with them. But by the early 1980s, there began to emerge the first steps toward distributed computing. I had an unfair advantage because I got to know people at Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center, kind of the dream visionary capital of the frontier of computing. That's where Steve Jobs managed to see the first graphical user interface actually running on a machine, which became ultimately the Macintosh. And then Bill Gates had to respond with Windows. So from that education at Xerox PARC, it began to become clear to me that this new architecture of computing, which initially was applied only in the niche applications of science and technology, technological computing, for example, specialized hardware that could actually design a printed circuit board. You can't imagine how primitive, how underpowered by our standards computers 40 years ago were. But by the end of the 80s, they began to scale. And I had an idea. IBM, the dominant company, the company that absolutely dominated commercial computing, was so locked in to its technical architecture and so, how shall I put it, addicted to the enormous profits that its proprietary systems were generating, that I thought there was a really good bet to make that they would not be able to respond if and when we could bring to market software that would enable these distributed systems to deliver the kind of very large scale enterprise class applications for banks, for communications companies, for manufacturing, for the service industries generally. And that's what we bet on through a variety of different investments, of which the most successful came to be BEA Systems. Along the way, the internet began to emerge from being a kind of plaything of scientists who could communicate with each other. That's what its original purpose. Its original customer was the National Science Foundation. And then all the way across the world in Geneva, a really bright guy who wanted to share files created something called the World Wide Web. And Tim Berners-Lee, being a scientist, not an entrepreneur, gave the World Wide Web to the world. And then a really smart kid at the University of Illinois named Marc Andreessen did a kind of productization of the World Wide Web. That was the first browser. It was called Mosaic, became the basis for a company called Netscape. Netscape went public in 1994, and all of a sudden, we began to imagine that the internet might evolve from being a specialist communication channel for scientists to being an environment for commercial transactions. So that became the second mission, to deliver the software that would enable the internet to become a place where you could buy and sell stuff safely. And again, Veritas Software, BEA Systems, the companies you mentioned, well, it happened that those companies began to generate real revenues, real profits, real cash flow in about 1996. And over the next 3 years, the world of speculation, the world of stock market investment, decided that they, along with companies like Cisco in the router business, were going to enable a new economy, the internet-based digital economy. So the valuation of those companies rose by a factor of 10 in the course of about 3 years, 4 years. Now, again, I have to confess, I had another unfair advantage. A long time ago, back at the University of Cambridge, from where I'm speaking to you right now, I did a PhD thesis. I got my PhD in economics, and I wrote my thesis, my dissertation, on 1929 to 1931. 1929 was the peak moment and the year of the greatest crash in the history of the stock market, the peak moment of the boom, the technology-driven boom of the 1920s. So in 1999, I'd seen the movie before. I knew how it ended. And at Warburg Pincus, we took my portfolio and liquidated it in the course of 2.5 years as aggressively as possible into the great bubble of 1996, 2000.
Wow. You got out before it hit, then you knew it.
Yeah, we didn't get out of everything because we owned too much of some stuff, but we got out of a lot. We got out of a lot.
Yeah, I guess the writing was on the wall, and if you study history, then you can predict the future to some degree. Yeah.
Well, it's always hard. It's hard even to predict the past, let alone the future. But there are signals. There are times when it becomes clear that valuations are decoupling from the underlying cash flows that are the foundations of real value over long periods of time. And there's a signal, there's a signature. Here's a secret. Here's a secret for your listeners, for your viewers. when prices rise, the first principle of economics, when prices rise, demand should decline. The quantity demand should decline when the price increases. In a stock market bubble, what you can observe is that as the price rises, trading volume increases. There's more demand for the stock that you, NVIDIA is a perfect example. Look at the trading volume against the price of NVIDIA over the last year. You can see the same thing in those crazy meme stock, the meme bubble, the GameStop kind of thing.
GameStop, yep. Oh my God.
You can see the same thing. You see the same thing in crypto. The signature of a bubble is that rising prices triggers more demand until eventually it bursts. All bubbles do burst, and usually, because the other thing that a rising price does, and this does correspond with economic theory, it calls forth more supply. So in 1999, 2000, as the tech bubble drove prices to very high levels, all sorts of startups were able to go public. Not just great companies with great innovative technology, like not just BEA and Veritas, but a whole variety of others, like, as I say, Cisco, for example, VMware, lots of companies, including those notorious Pets.com companies, went public. Now, you can't sell the shares for 6 months because when you go public, the underwriters require that you lock up. But between the third quarter of 1999, $4 billion worth of shares in new public companies were distributed to the limited partners of the venture capitalists. In the fourth quarter, almost $12 billion. In the first quarter of 2000, more than $20 billion worth of those new shares in thinly traded new companies. So the supply soared. And that probably is why in the second week of the second quarter of 2000, the NASDAQ hit its all-time high and declined radically and for a sustained period of time afterwards. So reading the market, not as an enthusiast, but as an analyst, as you say, with some historical sense, some historical knowledge, it can help protect you from getting carried away. Because there's an old line in Wall Street. When you're in a bubble, it's better to get out a month, a year too soon than a minute too late. It goes up on the escalator, it comes down on the elevator.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. You've been around some big players, and you mentioned a few. Is there anybody that really stands out as impressive when it comes to entrepreneurship, leadership, or just any type of inspiration in your life? And I would love to understand how you even came across George Soros, because obviously he's talked about quite a bit
I'll
nowadays.
give you three very, very different people. The first is the fellow who gave me an introduction, invited me in to Xerox PARC. His name is John Seely Brown, a physicist, but with a very broad engagement with the world of ideas. He ran Xerox PARC. He became chief scientist of Xerox, and he was an absolute inspiration in making me think beyond the immediate horizon, making me think about the kind of long-term vision which informed the inventions going on at Xerox PARC, which sadly, Xerox itself, the corporation, couldn't take advantage of. Xerox had the same problem IBM had. It was making so much money in the copier business that the new projects coming out of Xerox PARC could not compete financially for resources. But John was an enormous, JSB is how he's known to the world, enormous inspiration. Then that was around 1980, 81. 10 years later, I met a guy called Tim O'Reilly. Tim had graduated from Harvard. He actually had a degree. He majored in classics, but he was fascinated with computers. And he started a company. His first activity was making mimeograph manuals before the PC, before any PC, for the first computers that were small and cheap enough that a mere civilian, not a corporation, could buy one. So Tim provided the guide you needed, the missing manual, and then built that into a company called O'Reilly Media, became the publisher of the books through which an enormous number of technologists, of entrepreneurs, of programmers learned the trade, learned the craft of programming. And in 1992, he was another guy like John Seely Brown who saw over the horizon, and he still does. He began to notice that the internet was beginning to generate not Amazon or Google, but websites where people could go and share ideas before social media. And so he created something called the Global Network Navigator, GNN, the first guide. You could get a floppy disk, you put it into your PC or into your Macintosh, and it would give you a kind of directory to find different stuff, different information, different communities on the internet. And I came across, I thought this was really cool, really cool. So I got in touch with him. I flew out, in those days, I lived in New York. I was based in New York, but I probably was in the San Francisco Bay Area, something like 26 weeks of the year. Let's just say I had 3 million miles on American within 10 years of when they created Air Miles. So I went to have a cup of coffee with Tim. This was soon enough after the '89 earthquake that the freeway in Oakland that was still standing, you couldn't drive on it, but it created very nice shade for a coffee bar. So we had and Tim remembers, he wrote this down at one point, that the first words I said to him was, Tim, I'm never going to invest in your company, but I really want to get to know you, because he had such great ideas, but it was also clear that he didn't want a venture capitalist. He didn't want somebody who needed to generate, 5x, 10x return in 5 to 7 years, telling him how to run the company. But we created a kind of a friendship, an intellectual friendship that became deeper than that. In 2002, after the bubble burst, his company had been growing like crazy. All of a sudden, he had to cut back. He had to lay some people off. And he reached out to ask if I would join his board. I'm still on his board 22 years later. And it's one of the most extraordinary places from which to view what's going on in the digital universe. So that's my third. George Soros is another almost 10 years. So 2008, the global financial crisis. Now, I am a card-carrying economist. I do have a doctorate in economics. I was alienated from the kind of mainstream economics associated with the University of Chicago because I knew that markets are really complicated and messy because I was living in them as a venture capitalist. I knew that what goes on in the financial markets and the financial system has a deep impact and a contradictory impact often on what's going on in the real economy of employment, of consumption, of investment, of savings. And the economics that was dominant by the 1980s basically said, markets are efficient, left to themselves, they will deliver the efficient answer of how resources are allocated. And by the way, we don't have to worry about the financial system because the stock market is efficient and the bond market is efficient and banks are self-interested and they'll never do really stupid and destructive stuff. So when the global financial crisis hit, it wasn't just a crisis for the world's financial system and the world's economy. It was a crisis for economics. And Soros, to his credit, called together a bunch of people, not including me, but including some friends of mine, and launched something called the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I got to be aware of this because their first conference, their presentation to the world, took place at the University of Cambridge, where I have a lot of friends, and where by then I'd come back home, if you like. My wife and I established a sort of second home base here in Cambridge, where I'm talking to you from where I'm talking to you right now. And I saw in the top newspaper, the Financial Times, that there was going to be a big conference on economics at King's College, because King's College happened to be the college where the great John Maynard Keynes was a fellow, from which he worked. And I had written my PhD thesis, supervised by Keynes's #1 student, Richard Kahn. So I didn't know anything about this conference, but I saw that some of the people on the board were people I knew. So I called up one of them and started talking. And then at the conference, I think probably I met Soros for the first time at that conference. And then back in New York, we did some more talking. And he put up a really substantial amount of money. And I decided that this was a really useful initiative. The discipline, the practitioners of economics needed opportunities for talking to each other, for trying things out, for trying new ideas out that didn't fit with what the top journals were accustomed to publishing. And so providing some funding for original research, providing some conferences, some convenings, a website for publishing and amplifying and supporting this kind of new work was really something worthwhile. So I actually had a kind of funny sort of negotiation with George. What he had contributed was such a tiny proportion of his net worth. His net worth was so much more than mine that when I said I'd put up a third of what he had put up, I said I would do that only if he doubled down. And it would still be a tiny portion of what his net worth was relative to my net worth. So I became what technically was known as a co-founder of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I was on the board there for a dozen years. Now I'm somewhat older, and I've got a few other claims on my time. And frankly, the scarcest resource any of us have nowadays is attention. And INET has done a great job. It has provided an enormous service to the discipline of economics and to the world. And so I'm no longer on the board, but I'm a cheerleader for it. And that's how I got to know the third of those extraordinary men who helped shape my life. And I have to say that Soros's own economics, his own understanding of market dynamics, what he calls reflexivity, actually fits with what I totally have read and seen, that the world works, the markets work. When what Soros is talking about is, I see a market price, I make a decision, I act, that affects the market price, even if I'm not necessarily operating at Soros's scale. And that where we've got multiple people in a market, and none of them know exactly what the future is going to be. None of them know what the consequences of their decisions are going to be, because the future lies ahead. But everyone also knows that nobody else knows. So they have to watch each other, they have to follow each other. They have to try to see, is this a bubble? Or on the other hand, is this a market that's oversold? Are people beginning to think maybe it's time to come in? So reading the market, as Soros does, is in many ways a kind of exercise in psychological analysis of people operating under conditions of uncertainty where they know that everybody else is also under the same conditions. Back some 85 years ago, Keynes wrote this up as the beauty contest, where we're trying to pick not the prettiest girl, but the girl that everybody, this was 1936, so forgive the sexism involved. But there were newspapers competitions where the game was, don't pick who you think is the prettiest. Pick the one who you think the average of all the opinion of all the people who participate in the game, whom the average will think is the prettiest. And that's like picking what you think the average is the average. At what price will average opinion decide that NVIDIA is now overpriced, right? Or Apple is overpriced. People seem to have thought that maybe Google's a little overpriced. So you're trying to read that kind of environment. And Soros was a genius at it. And his insight is very powerful, and it very much informed my view. And as I say, reinforced what I learned as a student of one remove from Keynes in 1999. What I learned in 1969 and what I applied in 1999, because I recognized that the world was like 1929.
Well, I've done a little bit of research on him, and I'm in some circles that, kind of see what he's up to, but you know him well. Do you believe that he loves America? And do you also believe that he's a champion for people like me, entrepreneurs? Because in my personal opinion, I think he's a brilliant capitalist, but he owns socialists. So what are your thoughts on that?
Frankly, his greatest contribution, and the one he has been most deeply committed to, and anyone who actually really studied what the Open Society Foundation has done would realize how seriously they should take that name, because it was George Soros who funded in Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest all of the reformers, all of the people who fought the Soviet system, who created the basis for the liberation of Central Europe from the Soviet authoritarian, totalitarian control. That was Soros. In fact, Orban, the guy that Tucker Carlson's in love with in Budapest, was a Soros scholar. He had a scholarship from Soros when he was a kid, and he was part of the Velvet Revolution that reached from Prague, from Poland to Czechoslovakia to Hungary. The notion that Soros is a socialist, he funded the people who broke the back of communism in Central Europe. That's what you should know.
Interesting. Yeah, he's he's definitely popular in the Democrat circles, and I don't see a lot of Democrats championing on a lot of entrepreneurs like myself. So that's why I say that. However, DEI and everything that represents, I believe that goes against completely what capitalism is. Capitalism
well,
is
good for you. I think that capitalism has done better when it's more open to entrepreneurs who don't look like you and me.
Do you think so? So explain that to me, just so I understand, because I think that if you are trying to obtain capital, I believe everybody should become entrepreneurs and, obtain wealth, and there should be no limitations. There should be no requirement. You go after what you want, you build what you want, and your service to others is what predicts how much money you make. So when you have certain boxes that people have to fit in to obtain X amount of dollars, and you have money being given to you out of the box without having to do anything, I think that defeats the whole purpose of capitalism. So maybe you can explain that.
I have no idea why you think that including opening up paths of education is a way of subsidizing people who on their own can't do it.
They can do it. Why couldn't they do it? I believe everybody can do it. God has given us such an ability to solve problems. Well, why can't they do it, sir?
Read some history. Read some history on the discrimination against, for example, I'll tell you a story. This is a true story. Go back and look at the Ivy League schools in 1950. Every one of them had quotas to limit the number of Jews allowed to enter the university. Every one of them.
That's
Every
74
one of
years
them.
ago. That's
That,
a generation ago, right?
yeah, that's right. And generations keep evolving. And so Jews now are not discriminated against, but other people are now beginning to have access to the same tools of self-education, tools of education that empower them to become entrepreneurs. I'll tell you, at my firm, we had a terrible time getting the younger professionals to accept the idea that a woman could succeed as a venture capitalist. They would undermine them. They would exclude them. They would make sure that they were the one holding the short straw. Finally, we had to take them out and beat the shit out of them in the woodshed and tell them that they were going to just cut it out or they were gone. And that was 25 years ago. That was a short generation ago. Now we're beginning to see some of the positive consequences of that. We're opened up the entrepreneurial role of venture capital to half the population that 25, 30 years ago was excluded from access. I'm speaking from personal experience, but there is also an enormous amount of data and some really high quality academic research that backs up every word I have just said.
And let's just talk about universal basic income, right?
I don't believe in it.
Good.
I don't
Okay.
believe in universal basic income.
But I believe
think that
Open
those
Society
resources-
Foundation is pushing for that. I believe
No, they're
want.
not. No, they're not. I
Okay.
mean, come on, don't just take what Tucker Carlson is feeding into your ear, or maybe he's got an intravenous line straight into your arm.
Tucker is a
reason I'm
free
against
man.
UBI,
We know
the
Tucker's a
reason-
free man. He's not bought and paid for. We know that at
The-
least, right?
The reason I'm against UBI is that I think those resources, those same resources, should be invested in public goods like community colleges, raising the quality, raising the teaching resources, providing the place where the skills that will be needed if we are going to bring high-tech manufacturing back to the United States. That is going to be a public-private partnership, just like the public-private partnership that won World War II, that won the Cold War. You know, President Obama said a few smart things that even Republicans might respect. One of them was that none of us, including you, did it by yourself. The reason I talk in my book about the platform that the Department of Defense built by funding the first semiconductor companies as their customer, by creating a software industry, by along the way attacking the monopolist AT&T and forcing AT&T to license its patents to everyone in the United States, empowering generation of entrepreneurs to create new technology companies. That was the role of the government. That was the public-private partnership that made the United States. By the way, you can take this all the way back. If you want to take this back and get into the deep history of the United States, the most important innovation that enabled mass production was the ability to make things with interchangeable parts. So you didn't have one artisan making one musket. Do you know where interchangeable parts was first reduced to practice?
I'm thinking probably late 1800s, 1860s, somewhere in there.
No,
I know
it was 1820 at the Springfield Armory of the United States Army. And from the Springfield Armory, where they made guns, engineers spread out into a whole wave of new industries that nobody could imagine would be major commercial successes, such as sewing machines, Singer sewing machines, such as typewriters, such as bicycles, such as automobiles,
Harley
all
Davidson.
dependent
You could really
on the
take.
innovation
Yep, I get you.
that came out of the Springfield Armory.
Wow.
Just like the internet came out of DARPA and the National Science Foundation.
Wow. Yeah, I guess that's a good way to look at it. When it comes to certain industries were born based off of war, right? And you bring up a very good point. I think it's when you're talking about the government running it, running the world and
Talking
funding a
about the
lot of people.
government as
I think it's the
research
war machine.
funding and first customer, first supportive, collaborative customer. And by the way, there's a Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley almost would have had to be called Germanium Valley. Now, this is the last little story we'll have time for. I love telling stories.
Yeah, you're great at it, sir. You are.
So when the first transistors were invented at AT&T, and then came West with a guy called Shockley, who was a monster, got pushed out of AT&T. His mother happened to live in Palo Alto. And from his company, a set of brilliant engineers created a company called Fairchild, which became Intel, and then became the mother of Silicon Valley. But all of the transistors they were making were made of germanium because germanium has the better physical characteristics as a semiconducting material. But it's a bitch to make. It's really hard to process it. And at a certain point, the US Air Force, which was starting to use transistors in the kind of electronics that you need in a fighter plane or a bomber, they called up the suppliers and said, you guys better stop using this germanium stuff, because at high temperature, and you get to high temperature if you're driving a fighter plane at twice the speed of sound, it fails. It just doesn't work. So you better learn how to use this material, which isn't quite as perfect in terms of the physics, but as a practical matter, you can make a lot more of it, and it's reliable, and it's called silicon. So the Air Force was responsible for turning Germanium Valley into Silicon Valley as a customer.
Wow. I didn't know that history.
The US Air Force did not manage Intel, but it gave Intel the contracts that enabled Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce and Andy Grove to build one of the greatest companies of the 20th century.
The military industrial complex run the government, in my opinion, right? So when I see a group of people get on board to go to war or whatever, I always find out who's making money. And I'm sure you've traced the steps on that. And it's pretty similar every single time, who makes the money, who gets the contracts. In my opinion, that's not capitalism.
I don't think we need conspiracy theories to follow the trail. You told me that at the end of our talk, I'd have a chance to promote one book. I'm going to promote my book because I don't think you've read it.
No, I will be really. I'm going to check this out. I will.
I think it's time for you to read my book, reflect on it, and then maybe you invite me back and we'll have another conversation.
I think we have to, yeah. And right after 2024 election, and that's what I want to ask you about before we wrap up today. One's a capitalist, one's a socialist. Who do you think is best for America?
First of all, I reject the terms of your question. Trump is a grifter and Biden's a politician.
Oh, come on.
Neither of them are socialists. Neither of them are capitalists.
One is owned by Soros. We both know that, at least, right?
No, one would do a hell of a lot better if he weren't owned by himself.
What do you mean? That's the greatest compliment. If an individual has made his own money, he's unbuyable. And if somebody can't be bought, you have a free soul, Mike, to do what you think is right.
We're done. We're done. Bye for now. Enjoy your life.
Hey, I have to say, Bill, great talking with you, sir. Really, I had a great time. So, guys, check out his book, Doing Capitalism and the Innovation Economy. I'm going to go check this out more. Markets, speculation, and the state. So, Bill, thank you very much for your time. And, come back after I check this out, okay?
Cheer you on.
See you, buddy. Bye.